Good morning. We reached the last episode of the chapter dedicated to early detection of later embryonic death and early fetal death. It's been a long way, a long trip, and I hope you have also found it interesting. Uh, Today, I would like to talk to you about causes of embryonic death that we may actually call fake news, and how ultrasound allow us to uncover these fake causes of gestational loss. Well, the following reasons are often considered as possible risk factors when discussing of early pregnancy losses. The type of the corpus luteum. There are still many technicians who have great prejudice about the corpus luteum with a cavity, thinking that it is a lesser quality corpus luteum. The shape of the corpus luteum, and in particular the shape and the size of the cavitary corpus luteum, the size, the diameter of the corpus luteum. Many technicians today still thinks that the success of the gestation is related to the diameter of the corpus luteum, the position of the gestation. Um, is there any scientific evidence that the risk of gestational losses can be related to the presence of right or left gestation? And is there a different predisposition to gestation losses due to the sex of the gestation? And last but not least, is there a different predisposition to gestational losses by sex of gestation in progress, depending on the position, right or left, of a male or female gestation? All these fake risk factors are not actually risk factors for gestational losses. There is no scientific evidence for any of them. Well, the cavitary corpus luteum is thought by many to be a second class corpus luteum, a corpus luteum that produces an insufficient amount of progesterone. However, this is not the case. Um, Between 35-70% of the corpus luteum in the dairy bostaurus during the first 10 days of the cycle have one or more than one cavities. This has convinced some sonographers to consider the presence of the cavitary corpus luteum at the time of the early diagnosis of gestation no gestation made between 25-28 days post insemination as a sign, critical sign for the gestation, a sign of no gestation. 2 and 3 follicular waves cows have an average cycle of 18-20 days and 22-20 days, 23 days respectively. Therefore, by carrying out an ultra early diagnosis at 25-27 days post insemination or an early diagnosis at 28 days post insemination, these cows are in the first 10 days of the cycle. If they are not pregnant, which would justify the presence of a large number of them with a cavitary corpus luteum. Well, however, associating the presence of a cavitary corpus luteum with no gestation at the time of the diagnosis of gestation no gestation is extremely wrong because of the very low negative predict value that this diagnostic strategy has. In fact, on average in dairy bostaurus, no less than 10% of the pregnant cows are found at 28-35 days of gestation with a cavitary gestational corpus luteum. At 60 days of gestation, gestational corpus luteum are still more than 7% with a cavitary. Therefore, making a negative diagnosis of gestation solely on the basis of the presence of a cavitary corpus luteum carries an enormous risk of false negative. We can therefore say that this is a hypothesis with very low sensitivity. Well, the shape of the corpus luteum, and in particular the shape and the size of the cavity or the cavities of the corpus luteum, should also not be considered as a factor in establishing relationships with the risk of gestation, no gestation. No one has ever demonstrated a possible relationship between the shape and the size of the corpus luteum cavity and the risk of later embryonic death and or early fetal death. Well, again, the predict value of this hypothesis is extremely low in that. Well, the size of the corpus luteum is a subject that has always fascinated sonographers and technicians involved in bovine reproduction in general. Most of those who works in bovine reproduction seeing that a large corpus luteum produce a large amount of progesterone, while vice versa for a small corpus luteum. Unfortunately, it is not so simple. The size, the diameter of the corpus luteum does not always reflect the production of the progesterone. And in the presence of a gestation with a small corpus luteum, there is no scientific evidence that direct or indirect progesterone supplementation reduce the risk of gestational losses. Direct supplementation with intravaginal device or indirect supplementation with GnRH or HG. Well, during the metaestrus, the level of the progesterone produced by the corpus luteum is very low. At the time of the deviation of the first dominant follicle, the progesterone level is 1.5 2 nanogram per milliliters, although in the presence of a 15 millimeters corpus luteum. During the 5th and 10th day of the cycle, the corpus luteum reaches 85-90% of its maximum size, but the progesterone level at on day 10 of the cycle is 4.5 nanogram milliliters. Between day 10 and 14 of the cycle, the corpus luteum reaches its maximum size, actually growing very little, but the level of the progesterone produced is 7.58 nanogram per milliliters. In absence of gestation, or if the mom does not recognize the presence of the embryo in the uterus, the luteolysis begins. The functional atresia of the corpus luteum is completed by day 18 of the cycle, but the size of the corpus luteum is still between 18 and 22 millimeters. In fact, anatomical atresia begins 72 hours later than functional atresia. In the heifers, the luteal volume is about 36% less than in cows, but the amounts of circulating progesterone in heifers is about 30% greater than in cows. The reason is simple. The liver catabolism of the steroid hormones is very intense in particular in dairy cattle and in particular in those cows that produce a lot of milk. Well, in these cows, the feed intake of dry matter is necessary very high, and so therefore also the liver blood flow that is very high, which in these cows that are producing a lot of milk, um, reaches and exceeds 2,000 liters in 1 hour. Well, in ruminants, the right ovary is the one that works most. It is on the right ovary that there is the greatest number of ovulation, and therefore it is on the right horn, uterine horn, that gestations develop more. In one of the previous episodes of this training about gestational losses, we saw that a gestation that developed in the uterine horn opposite the position of the gestational corpus luteum has a poor chance of survival because there is 35% less progesterone in this uterine horn that is opposite to the corpus luteum. Well, in this case, the question is whether a right or left handed gestation has a different predisposition to disappear. Well, there is no scientific evidence for this hypothesis. Therefore, right and left hand gestations have the same probability of to disappear. Well, is there a different probability of gestational losses depending on the sex of the pregnancy? Well, there is scientific evidence that in some races, due to a genetic alteration, there is a different predisposition to gestational losing depending on the sex of the fetus. However, apart from these very rare cases, which, as I repeat, are linked to an alteration in genetic code and limited only to certain breeds of cattle, there is no predisposition to pregnancy loss in Bostaurus linked to the sex of the pregnancy that is in progress. Well, another question, the last question, is there a different probability of gestational losses by sex of the fetus because of its position, right or left? No, there is any scientific evidence for this hypothesis. A few years ago, it was proposed that more males were born on the right and more female on the left. Well, in this trial that I show in this slide, I tried to test this hypothesis and I found that there was no scientific evidence for it. Instead, I found that both males and females were more likely to be born on the right than on the left. And this is justified by the fact that the right ovary is the most active in ruminants. Well, always in this trial, I was also able to ascertain that there was no different predisposition to gestational losses by reason of the sex and by reason of gestation position. A male or a female, right or left, has the same probability of losing gestation. Well, in summary, there is no scientific evidence that in the presence of a gestational corpus luteum with one or more than one cavity, there is an increased risk of gestational losses. Two, the size and or the shape of the cavity of the gestational corpus luteum, of course, when it's present a cavity, cannot be related to the risk of gestational losses. Well, three, the diameter of the gestational corpus luteum, with or without cavity, cannot be related to gestational losses. Four, the site of gestation is not a predisposing factor for gestational losses. And five, that is the last but not the least, the sex of the current gestation, as well as its position, right or left, don't represent a risk factor. I wish you an excellent vision and look forward to a new ultrasound adventure. Viva!